Welcome to the final lecture in our series, Money Talks, Economics and Public Policy. This evening's lecture, presented by Paul R. Krugman, will be followed by a short question and answer and a book signing. And as Mark told you, Paul Krugman's book, The Great Unraveling, is available for sale down here at the table. I want to thank Logan Fox and McCorber Books for providing the books, and they're also going to be donating part of the proceeds of these sales to the Princeton Adult Schools, so we're very grateful for that. I also want to thank Princeton's TV 30 and Yulia Zaks for taping this series, as they have taped all of the lecture series for Princeton Adult School. And these tapes will be available at the library for viewing in January, for borrowing and viewing in January, and they also will be broadcast on TV 30 beginning in January. So don't miss them. Great reruns. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Paul Krugman, Professor of Economics and International Affairs, Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He is the author or editor of dozens of books and several hundred articles, primarily about international trade and international finance. Krugman is also nationally known for his twice-weekly column in the New York Times and his monthly columns in Fortune magazine and Slate. His most recent book with Maurice Obstfeld is International Economics Theory and Policy, and forthcoming, the second part of his textbook with Robin Wells, Macroeconomics. And of course, The Great Unraveling, a collection of his New York Times op-ed articles. His earlier books, Peddling Prosperity and the Age of Diminished Expectations, have become modern classics. He was the Ford International Professor of International Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has served on the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors. He was the recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal, an award given every 2 years by the American Economic Association to the top economists under 40. Professor Krugman's contributions to the field of economics are numerous and invaluable. For the layperson, however, and for those of us who may be a little number challenged and economically theory challenged, like me, Professor Krugman's ability to clearly and yet brilliantly explain the crucial connections between economics, business, and public policy is unsurpassed. And I don't know how many of us would get through the week without knowing that we can start the week off and end the week reading what Paul Krugman has to say in the New York Times. So please join me in welcoming Paul Krugman.
Yes, I'm amplified. Okay. I always have to correct. I don't know how it gets into the standard bio. It says I was on the Council of Economic Advisors. For those of us who are sticklers, it's a big thing, because it was during the Reagan administration, and the council are political appointees. The staff, at least in the past, was a much more technocratic thing, so I was on the staff. I was the senior international staffer. The senior domestic staffer was a guy, Larry Summers. Don't know what happened. Okay. I thought I'd talk tonight about, actually there's a subject that is in economics that has been preoccupying me now for several years. I think it's really at the core of the story of what's happening to America these days. And it also happens to be in this week's news. You might know, and if you read my column on Monday, you know a little bit of what I think here, that right now the White House is trying to make a push on the economy. Good stuff is happening in the economy, and we deserve credit. And that's partly, it's what everyone says about the economic news. It's better than some of the other news. And subjects I will not get into unless that comes up later in the questions and answers. But it's also that they genuinely think that good stuff. They're looking at the employment number was pretty good in the most recent month. Gross domestic product growth is, by historical standards, quite good. That it looks to them like this ought to be a great economy, and they think people should be really happy. And yet, if you look at what people say, to public attitudes, the average, the typical American is quite unhappy. By margins of almost 2 to 1, people are unhappy with the state of the economy. In fact, a substantial majority of people say that the economy is getting worse, not better, despite all of these numbers about growth. And the people at the White House and their supporters are just, they can't understand it. It's what's wrong. And in fact, I just saw today that Greg Mankiw, who is the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, actually he was junior staff at the same time Larry Summers. Where economics is a little bit of a village. We sort of all know and know each other for decades and like or hate each other forever. Anyway, never mind that. But he was saying that he thinks that it's Iraq. That people's negative feelings about one thing are just carrying over, and it's. Now, I actually say I think that's a pretty awkward position for certainly. He's not speaking at this point officially, but it's kind of the line. It's really an awkward position for any government to be in. Basically, boy, you people are dumb. You just don't understand how well off you are. Let us tell you. It's not a very good position. And the funny thing about it is that actually, if you just step a little bit past those numbers that they like to focus on, which are the numbers that most people, that make the economic headlines most of the time, you actually find out that there's a very good reason why most people are unhappy. Because if you look not at the gross domestic product, which is this measure of sort of how much is the economy producing, or the employment numbers, which are actually a lot less impressive. But you look at things that bear directly on the income, the standard of living of the typical family. They're not good at all. So the standard number that we use, the simplest measure of how well is the typical American family doing, is median family income. Line up all the families in the United States in order of income, take the family. Principle, how it's actually done, is a little bit more black magic than that. But in principle, to take the family in the middle, find out what its income is. If you look at the median family income adjusted for inflation, well, it went down last year. It went down even though it was last year was a year of pretty fast economic growth, 4.2%, but none of that trickled down to the typical family. If you look at the other thing, which is most obvious, which is wages, you discover that overall wages have grown very little, despite the fact that the economy has been growing. And the wages of non-supervisory workers have actually not been keeping up with inflation. So the non-managerial, non-elite workers actually seem to be losing ground. People actually seem to be getting worse off, despite what looks like a successful growing economy. And how is that possible? Well, the answer, of course, is that it's an increasingly unevenly divided pie. And the growth in inequality, the increase in the share of the total pie that's going to people at the top, particularly in this case, the share that's going into profits income, which ultimately, lots of Americans own a little bit of stock. But that's very misleading if you want to think that although slightly over half of Americans have directly or indirectly some holding in the stock market, the great bulk of stock ownership, direct or indirect means through retirement accounts or pension funds. The great bulk of it is still highly concentrated, actually more so than ever, concentrated in the hands of a few percent of the population. So the income has been flowing to a relatively small economic elite, and the typical family is seeing basically none of it, and families at the bottom actually are losing ground. That's not a political statement. That's just it's not even a policy statement until I tell you what, if anything, can be done about it. But it's just the fact of the matter is that we have economic growth, which is essentially all going to the top 20% of the population, and very largely to just the top few percent of the population in terms of income. It's pretty spectacular. And I guess I would say, just slightly, you all know what my politics are, but just to say that I actually believe that the people in the White House are sincerely unable to grasp this. They've been so, they're so accustomed to the idea that a rising tide must raise all boats, to the idea that any discussion of the distribution of income is discredited class warfare, that they just can't grasp that the reason they're not. The economy certainly has been growing since late 2001. Basically none of that growth getting through to wages, none of that growth getting through to the income of typical families. Profits are up, even after you adjust for inflation, profits are up 50% over that period. Total wage and salary income is up 7%. And a lot of that is wage and salary income does include bonuses to CEOs and so on. So a lot of it is really at the top, very little share with people further down. So we've got a situation where the growth in inequality has swamped the overall growth of the economy from the point of view of middle and lower income families. I've actually gotten a barrage of mail after Monday's column for my sort of in passing remark that it's not easy to blame this on the policies of the Bush administration. People saying, of course it must be, but it's not. We don't quite. I have plenty of complaints, but in this case, something is going on that I think goes beyond the policies of the current group in Washington, or at least the links are much more subtle than that. And part of the evidence for that is that this story didn't begin in 2001, didn't begin in the most recent years. The disconnect between the growth of the economy as a whole and the standard of living of most people in the United States has actually been, it's gotten more exaggerated now than before, but this is actually a story that goes back several decades. So I want to give you an overview of history, looking at it really, if you could say what I've just done now, so I talked about the last 4 years, let me now talk in succession about the last 60 years and then about the last 100 years. So I'm going to give you two perspectives on history. If you look at the history of the U.S. economy since World War II, what you find is that it divides pretty neatly into two halves. In the first half, which is the great post-war boom, you have fast-growing economy, fast-growing incomes, with the benefits of the growth spread very widely. If you look, basically between the end of World War II and about 1973, about the time I think we had the recession following the first Middle Eastern oil shock, basically everything doubled. The wage rate, purchasing power of the typical worker, median family income, gross domestic product per capita, everything doubled. Just this relatively smooth growth. If you do it, I don't have any PowerPoint slides. I'm not going to do that. Inflict that on you. But since I've got a Blackboard and a lavalier mic, I can do the economist type thing. If you do a picture, and I just show you the rate of growth of income, and I look at I divide the population into quintiles. 1, 2, 3, 4, the bottom 20%, the next 20%. What it looks like, so these are our quintiles. Over the first half of the post-war period, what it looks like is a picket fence. They're really almost all exactly the same height. Everybody's gaining at about the same rate. So that was and that to some extent we still in our minds live in that period where a growing economy is good for everybody, it all goes together. It's hard for us, we still, even though this is a story that's 30 years out of date, it still is in our minds that this is the way things ought to be. Okay, if you look at what happened in the second period, the whole apparatus, same picture. So we've got our rate of growth here. And the quintiles again. What it looks like, here's the middle, the income distribution. Actually, I'm wrong. The middle of the income distribution is a quite slow rate of growth. Much faster for people a bit higher up, substantially faster for people further up. Basically nothing here. And actually, depending on exactly which measure you use, people at the bottom getting a bit worse off, actually below 0. And the other thing that we know is that actually top 20%, I should know where the break point for that is, but it's not at the level that you think of as really rich. It's actually not at the level of income that would allow you to buy a house anywhere in Princeton. But what we've done, what people have done, and the data are much more difficult to assemble, but they've got sort of the top 1%. And what that looks like, more or less, is it's enormous explosion of income at the very top. So it's a very, and you can go within that. Actually, it turns out it's fractal. The top 10% has done very well. The top 1% far more than that. The top 10%, and so on, up to Bill Gates. Basically, it's a enormous expansion of wealth at the top. Okay, it's different. It's a complete change in the process. Nowadays, you're just starting to see people say, well, isn't it always true that growth in the economy goes disproportionately to people at the top? So we're starting to shift to a state of mind where we view this as the normal story. But that's not at all what we used to think. We used to think that broadly shared growth was the normal story. Second thing, okay, so that's right, because something switched. Something changed about the way the U.S. economy, about how the gains of growth are being shared. Oh, I guess I should mention, we had a new piece of data this morning. The productivity came out, and the last quarter turns out to be very good. Productivity, the output per hour of U.S. workers rose sharply. The actual compensation per hour, adjusted for inflation, the amount of workers are paid, actually fell. So it's all in microcosm in the latest numbers. Okay, well, let's take the broader, even a longer historical sweep. Because it turns out that the starting point right after World War II was very, very different from the way that the United States had looked a couple of decades earlier. If you go back to the 1920s or before, the United States was an extremely unequal society. Enormous concentration of wealth at the top, enormous concentration of income at the top. Think Great Gatsby, or even more, think Gilded Age. Highly, highly unequal. And something happened during the 30s and the 40s. And of course, you can all think about the various things that occurred. There is the Depression, the New Deal, and the war. And it's very hard to figure out. There's so much going on, so much abnormality. It's hard to sort out what's what during that period. But when the dust settled, and it's 1946, 1947, we were a much more equal society than we were at the beginning. In 1929, we were, obviously we don't have, the statistics get flakier as you go further back. We essentially have no statistics before 1913, which is when the income tax was first instituted. But 1929 was very nearly as unequal as it is within the range of our numbers. By 1947, we are we really are a middle-class society, quite even distribution of income. Claudia Golden at Harvard, who's worked on this, calls it the Great Compression. There was this, so the income differentials got greatly narrowed. And this period of relatively equal growth is that Great Compression sticking. Squeezed into a middle-class society for 30 years, we stayed a middle-class society, and we thought that was the way we were going to be. And then, we came apart. And again, events, the share of the wealthiest in total income fell for a couple of years at the beginning of this decade because some of it is capital gains, and capital gains turn into big capital losses, as they did for a while. That disproportionately affects people at the very top. We won't have, compensation of chief executives. There's a simple number. In the mid-1970s, the CEOs of major corporations were paid on average about 40 times what the average worker was paid. And we thought of that as a lot. By 2000, it was up to about 500. It fell to about 250 in the first couple of years of the what do we call this decade? The 20s? So anyway, of this decade. But it appears to be back up to 400 plus now. So we'll probably, and we will have, it'll actually be a couple of years before we have the, we know what the distribution of income was at the very top, even in 2004, because we don't, those are coming with a lag, but it's pretty clear that we've gone back to where we were roughly in 2000. And in 2000, as best we can tell, the United States was pre-tax just as unequal as it was in 1929. The distribution of income before taxes was actually just about identical to the distribution of income in 1929. So the Great Gatsby era was fully back in economic terms. Now you might say, well, but we now have income taxes, which are progressive, and we have social programs, and yeah, that does mitigate it, but not as much as you think. Income taxes do fall more heavily on the wealthy than they do on people in the lower, middle and lower income. But other taxes, quite a few, particularly state and local taxes, actually are regressive. They have a higher share of income paid by people at the bottom. Some programs, Social Security, certainly Medicare, mitigate the income difference. So we're not quite as intensely unequal society in actual outcomes as we were in 1929. But we moved a substantial way back towards being that kind of place. Awesome, tremendous social development. Now, is this obvious? Well, you can see, obviously, I think it's a bad thing, just in and of itself. And partly it's a bad thing because people, it means that middle and lower income people are not sharing in the benefits. That they would, if we had a more egalitarian distribution of income, people would have more. But also, and this gets really, gets somewhat subjective, but also gets into some issues I'll get to in a couple of minutes. I just think there's a problem of social cohesion. That when you have a society in which people, I don't want to say it's, when I was growing up, late 60s, early 70s, obviously a lot of tensions in the United States, but one of the things we did not have was a sense that people were living in different material worlds. You actually had feeling that it was a society in which blue-collar workers with solid jobs and managers, college graduates and non-college graduates were all differences in income, maybe even factors of 2 and 3, but not complete differentiation into just not at all living in the same society. Political issues, there was and this gets to one of the bigger issues, that we were not a very politically polarized country at the time. You can actually measure it. The people in the politics department, Nolan McCarty, they actually have ways of measuring these things, and Rosenthal and McCarty, and they find that political polarization in the United States peaked in the 20s, fell to very low levels, a lot of collegiality in the 60s, and has now risen and is now back at levels that you really didn't see since about the time of World War I. So that we just, in a whole bunch of ways, we pulled apart as a society. Okay, why is this happening? And the answer to that is, that's a good question. It actually turns out to be surprising. There's a lot of things that are surprising about this whole story. One of them is, the first, a lot of people try to focus on what's been happening since the 1970s. And there's some obvious things you can say. Globalization, clearly, to some extent, have foreign competition for some of those blue-collar jobs that used to pay quite well. Technology, maybe. Both of those push towards a story that says that you have an increased premium for skill and education. Certain things that it's more in this global economy. There are lots of people prepared to do manual labor, but the high-skill stuff. And it is true that there's been an increase in the premium associated, the extra wages associated with college education is. College-educated workers have done much better than those without. The trouble is that there's also been a huge increase in inequality even within the highly educated. So that, to put it, I guess the crude version, high school teachers and Fortune 500 CEOs typically have about the same number of years of formal education, but haven't exactly had the same income performance over the past 30 years. Even rates of growth have been nowhere similar. There's maybe changes in industrial, the kind of structure of industries, shift from a world in which General Motors is the quintessential American corporation, the big employer, to one in which Walmart is actually by far the biggest American private employer now. Clearly there are differences, although is it inherently necessary that big retail service corporations would have pay much lower wages and be just much harsher on their workers than big manufacturing corporations? We don't know that for sure. Unions have, in the private sector, unions were quite powerful and are now essentially gone. Basically, only a tiny fraction of private sector employment is now unionized. That's got to have an impact. It's kind of messy. We don't actually have a simple story. And of course, some of these things are themselves. Why did the unions decline so much? Here's another take. One question, one way to look at it is to go further back and ask, why did the Great Compression happen and why did it stick for a long time? And actually, if we look at it, it's pretty clear what the factors were that led to incomes being much narrowed. First, there was the big rise of unions during the 1930s. And secondly, there was the wage policy during World War II, which was actually in which everything was basically government regulated, and the government's powers were used, the wartime powers were used to greatly narrow income differentials. And basic textbook economics said, well, you're meddling with the laws of supply and demand, and the gods of supply and demand will come and punish you. And it didn't. The wages stayed where they were. The wage differential stayed where they were. And we had this long period of broadly shared growth. Let me just finish up by saying what actually happens in this discussion is a lot of us end up saying, there seems to be a lot more sociology in economics than we'd like to admit. It looks as if there were norms that were established about relative equality. Of course, strong unions is part of that, but there were norms established about relative equality that led to relatively equal pay, and that were established during the New Deal, during the war, that stuck for about 30 years, and then somehow sort of eroded, and just kind of unraveled. Not the unraveling actually in the book, but that it just kind of came apart. That in 1970, the corporation would not have dared to pay the CEO 500 times what the workers were paid. You just would have thought that this is, quite aside from strikes and all, you just would have thought that you can't get away with that. And little by little, that switched from being the unthinkable to the normal. We don't really, it's kind of mysterious. The other thing, which is mysterious in a way, is the political side. Simple theory of politics we all like to use is the median voter theory. So if you have competing parties, they should try to cluster near the center, near the voter that's sort of in the middle. And if you have a situation of hugely increasing inequality, in which the people at the top are doing very well, but the people in the middle are not seeing any gains, you would expect competing political system to try to say to the median voter, here, what we're going to do is we're going to have more, soak the rich or something, but make it milder. We're going to have more social programs, we're going to have more benefits, we're going to have national health care, we're going to pay for it by taxing the rich, who after all are getting richer and they can afford it. You would have expected, if you didn't know what the history was, you would have expected the political system to lean against this increasing inequality. In fact, the political system of the United States has leaned into it, has actually acted to exacerbate it. Tax rates have fallen at the top, and have actually, when you include payroll tax, which pays for Social Security and Medicare, have actually risen slightly for the middle family. So we've actually had the political system accentuate the income inequality, which is very odd. You might say, well, that's because the people have become convinced through that lower tax rates at the top end are really good for everybody. They've been convinced that supply-side economics or something like it is the right answer, and that a rise of tide raises whole boats. Two problems with that. One is, at least that's the evidence, or look at recent numbers, that's not true. The other thing is that if you look at polling results, by substantially more people, if you ask them, are you a liberal or conservative, substantially more people say I'm conservative. If you ask them, do you think that the United States government should guarantee health insurance to everybody, 70% say yes. If you actually look at people's positions on the issues, they look quite liberal. But conservatives not only win elections, but have people convinced that that's sort of a bad thing to say you're a liberal. And we can think about ways in which that works. And I'll just conclude by saying that the story that some of us tell, probably too simplistic, but the story that some of us tell is actually what's happening is that the increased income up here is in ways both crude and subtle, actually tilting the political process. You can think of all the various ways in which that happens, so that policy ends up reinforcing rather than opposing this tendency. I don't want to give a fiery political speech tonight. This is mostly about the economics. Just to say, this is amazing. It is, in the past 30 years, we've become a very, very different society, just in terms of the raw numbers from what we were before. We've gone from a broadly middle-class society with where there was certainly a serious problem of poverty, but wealth was just not a big issue. There were wealthy people, but they had such a trivial share of the total income that just wasn't a big part of the story, and in which you could basically say that take the old version of what's good. Actually, the guy never said what's good for General Motors is good for America. He actually said what's good for the country is good, what's good for General Motors and vice versa. But anyway, we went from a country in which what was good for GDP was good for the middle class, to one in which that's manifestly not necessarily true, in which we now have got, we've now had 5 years of growing gross domestic product and declining median family income. Maybe that has no consequences. Maybe it just becomes more so. One of the questions we've had is, now that the distribution of income is sort of back to what it was in the era of the Great Gatsby, is that a natural resting point? Was this just an interregnum of middle classness that's gone away and now we settle back? That might sound like a pessimistic point of view, but there's an even more pessimistic one, which is you haven't seen nothing yet. That it's going to become even more unequal, and we're going to go back to, I don't know, the income distribution of France under Louis XIV or something. It's really going to become even more so. We don't know that, but it's, at any rate, this ought to be the central issue, I think, of American political debate. Do we think it's a bad thing? If we do, what do we want to do about it? I don't think it's not easy to blame what has happened on any particular politician, but there certainly are vast differences among politicians in terms of what they think to respond. And I have to say, it's partly middle-aged nostalgia for being young, but I miss that country we used to be, and I would really like to get it back. With that, I'll throw it up for Q&A. Thanks.
70s.
Right.
That was the kind of.
Okay, so the question is what happened in the 1970s to cause us to move from one to the other? The answer, I mean, the true answer is that I don't know. That nobody knows for sure. Let me give you three things that happened in the 1970s that all that don't, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but let's give you a story. One story is 1971, Intel invents the microprocessor. So the beginning of a computer on a chip, basically. So the whole microelectronics computer revolution begins in the 70s, and maybe it's something about high technology that is pushing. And that's not just that you need more programs. One of the things that the original winner-take-all analysis in economics was saying that technology increases the reach of individuals. The crude example was mass media entertainment. It used to be there were a lot of comedians making a moderate living going through the Borscht Belt, and now there's Jay Leno, that kind of thing. So maybe it's the technology. This thing that happened in the 1970s, globalization as we know it really pops up in the 1970s. In fact, that's a whole different story. When I went to graduate school in economics, I thought economic development in the third world was the most important subject, and decided not to work on it, and not to do my degree in that because it was too depressing. Because in 1975 or so, there had been no success stories. There were no third world countries that had really made major gains since Meiji Japan in the 1880s. There had been sort of no new entrants to the club. And all that changed, and partly policy changes. So what happens in the 1970s is South Korea, Taiwan began becoming major exporters of manufactured goods. For the first time, we're going to get the third world getting into the business of manufactured goods. And then through the 80s, we get China, of course, ultimately coming in on an awesome scale. Third thing that happens in the 1970s is neoconservative intellectuals persuade business groups to start financing conservative think tanks, a network of conservative media, this whole structure that we now have. We take it for granted that there's a Heritage Foundation, that the talking heads on PE are mostly conservative. It wasn't like that in 1970. It was, in fact, it was liberal college professors who were where you went for stuff. So there's clearly and a whole set of networking, of lobbying, big change in the structure of the politics. That one of these things I sometimes say to liberals who want to change everything around. It's look, the movement that now runs things is this is a 30-year process. It goes back a long, long way. So those are three stories. The big acceleration in inequality coincides roughly with the Reagan administration. But if Reagan did that, I'll be damned if I can tell you how.
Right.
That's the thing. Mostly it's, although the taxes, the point there was a big increase in the pre-tax inequality of income. And how do you do this? It's not, anyway, but there's a lot of mystery in all this. Yeah.
Doesn't the tax system itself affect income? The example I like to give is, it's a little weird, but if you had a very progressive tax system and that income over, say, $1 million a year, the marginal rate were 99%, wouldn't that be a way for boards of directors to say, hey, look, we'd like to pay you $50 million a year, but most of that money is going to go to the treasury, so we're going to limit you to $1 million a year?
Yeah. Yes, there actually is. That's a. I was wondering. Yeah, exactly right. There is an issue, and people. First of all, there's a question about how much. Maybe some subterranean income comes to the surface when tax rates fall. So maybe people who are just kind of hiding it, or companies would be paying you in perks rather than in salary, although the perks don't go diminished.
Totally. I mean,
yeah. Or you might have just said that maybe you, as CEO, might say to yourself, well, it's not worth the acrimony I face in trying to pay myself this extra $10 million, considering I only get to keep $1 million of it anyway. Now, people have tried, economists have tried to actually estimate all that, looked at episodes, and there's some to it. They don't think, I have done none of this work independently. They don't think that it's a big part of the story. It's certainly not, I mean, let's put it this way, what's happened in the last couple of years, last few years, can't be explained that way. It's definitely true that the overall pie has grown quite a lot, and that median families have seen none of that.
The marginal rate was 70% until Reagan lowered it. It was actually 70%.
Actually, no, it was 50 until Carter lowered it, and then it went down. There's a lot of bipartisan. Yeah, there was a point when it was 90 something under that socialist Dwight Eisenhower. Yeah, actually, one of the things. I mean, of course, it was never effective at that rate. People bought horse farms and all that stuff. But and one of the things about it is amazing because it actually what Eisenhower era policies would be considered radical left now. No, there's some of that. I mean, but for what it's worth, you can look at episodes. It doesn't look as if that's dominant. But yeah, there's what that. Economic numbers are, first of all, always there's lots of changes in inputs. And the second thing is that there's more science fiction in those numbers than we like to admit in all cases.
After World War II, we were a nation of savers, up to 8–9%, and now we're a nation of borrowers. With I think recently I read that our country has a negative savings rate of 1.5%. What impact does us turning into borrowing rather than saving have on this distribution of wealth in America?
Okay, it's not clear. The question is when you change it to a nation of borrowers instead of savers. It's not clear what impact that has. The change does sort of coincide with the change in distribution, though I think if you were to try and sort of do the timing, it would be the other way around. That the savings rate really started to fall during the 80s. But yeah, that's a whole different. I mean, that's another remarkable thing about America now that individuals don't seem to save, and the country as a whole has very low savings, and we finance our investment with funds borrowed from abroad. I'm going to quote myself because it's one of my favorite lines. I like to get a zinger. But if you look at the U.S. economy right now, we basically make a living by selling each other houses and pay for the houses with money borrowed from the Chinese. I don't know the answer to that. Right, yeah.
It'd be great if you would care to comment on a couple of areas. Firstly, do you think that there's a high correlation to the smoothing out of the income bars because we were less of a knowledge economy in the 1950s, and today we're much more of a knowledge economy, and what's driving the disparity of incomes is that we're part of a global workforce, and the lower skilled workers have to, unfortunately, deal with compensation arrangements that are less satisfactory, or the jobs just go elsewhere. That's the first question. And then secondly, I was looking carefully at the top diagram that you have there, a chart, and I can think of a long list of Eastern Bloc countries that had very equal bars across the population spectrum, but they didn't manage to grow, and they're no longer around, or those systems are no longer around. If you could comment on that as well.
Oh, sure. I should say, let me do those in reverse. These are rates of growth. We're not talking about a system in which everyone had the same income, and that doesn't work, right? I mean, the days, I don't think even Fidel Castro anymore says that people should all do their work entirely out of for moral reasons and not without being paid extra. And bear with me. There's certainly some level of inequality that is just part of what you have to have. Where we are a market economy, and I would not, in the late 1970s, to the extent that I thought about it at all, but many people who are now liberals, who are were liberals then and are liberals now, in the 1970s would have said that, look, trying to squeeze the U.S. income distribution further is not valuable. There isn't that much inequality. In fact, the inequality serves a useful purpose. It provides incentives. You want to worry about poverty, which was a very different issue. But it was. So there's no. I'm not a radical egalitarian. I don't think anybody in the Princeton Economics Department is. And countries that have tried to be radically egalitarian obviously didn't make it. So that's. I think that's. The question is how much. And if you really think that we need to have levels of inequality as high as we now have, that's certainly something we could talk about. I would argue otherwise, but that is where the issue should be. The global, I guess I didn't say that long enough length. Yes, manual workers are to some extent competing with manual workers around the world, and that's one reason why the wages of blue-collar workers have gone badly. Except the highly educated workers are not doing very well, except for a select group of them. And there's something new, which I guess I should say. Until a few years ago, it did appear as though the distributional issues were worker versus worker. Although with workers including high-level managers and so on. But it was really about the distribution of labor income. All that has changed in the last few years. Now it really is profits as opposed to labor income. I mean, 5 years ago I was chiding people for crude Marxist notions that it was labor versus capital, and of course it still isn't. But there's a lot more like that if you look at what's happened since 2000. So the globalization is certainly an important part, but not all of it. And again, think about Walmart is the quintessential modern U.S. corporation. Walmart, in its business, does not compete internationally. And is it really necessary that people providing local services be paid an average of, I guess, about $17,000 a year, and for the most part not have health insurance? Actually, it's not so easy to just say, well, force them to do it, because then you have to ask questions about, well, will the job still be there? But it's not global competition that's holding down Walmart's wages, and it's not, except in a very indirect way, possible. I'm going to try and, yeah.
I'm interested in where we stand in the world in general, what the rate of growth quintile graphs look like in other first world economies and in third world countries.
Okay, in third world countries, the answer is simple. The data are hopeless. Actually, ours is not as good as we like to think. But from what we know that there's been a substantial increase in inequality in Latin America, for example. But how big is very, very flaky. In the United States, in fact, we are on this. We actually, for the most part, have better data than in other advanced countries because we have a consistent survey from the census. The current population survey has been consistent. That you can map it one to another year by year since 1947. So we actually have numbers that are comparable. The trouble in a lot of, I'm sorry, I'm shocked off. Okay, the problem in a lot of countries is somebody says, "Gee, I wonder how unequal income distribution is," and they go into a survey, and then 10, 15 years later, somebody says, "Oh, I wonder how unequal income distribution is," and they do a survey, and because the surveys are not identical and on a simple basis, you don't know whether the difference between the two is a real change in the economy or just a change in the survey design. So we have a consistent data set, which is much better. Now, advanced countries by and large have decent numbers, and the answer is European countries still look like that. except for Britain, which is sort of halfway between Europe and the United States. Canada looks kind of like the United States pre-tax, but in the Canada, the tax and transfer system has done the opposite of ours. It has leaned against it, so they've actually offset a lot of the increase in pre-government intervention inequality, so that the post-intervention has actually the inequality hasn't increased very much. Britain, there's a little interesting side thing. You have you've got three regimes in sequence. You have Thatcher, Major, and Blair. And during the Thatcher era, it looked very much like that. During the Major era, it kind of basically was the economy was pretty lousy for everybody. And during the Blair era, it's not quite like this, but there's definitely been a kind of end to the growing inequality, except at the very top end. The top 1% has floating incomes in Britain, as in the United States, although not to the same extent. But you can definitely see something change. So, but the U.S. is, in terms of the level of inequality, we're just off the scale. The people who do this stuff seriously, there's something called the Luxembourg International Survey. People who do this put out papers like, "Why is America so different?" We're just completely off the scale. For what the data are flaky, but yes, we appear to be less unequal than Brazil, but more unequal than Costa Rica, and absolutely unlike any other advanced country. Just nothing like it anywhere.
Can we just take one more question?
Okay. I'll take this from way up there.
Yeah, you made a brief reference earlier to sociological impact on economics, and I'm just wondering to what extent that might account for some of this shift, where maybe years ago, if the president of whatever corporation lived in the community and was visible to the community, and now you have these enormous corporations that do many things, and they're a lot less visible, except maybe you see them on the television once in a while. Verizon today announced that they're going to come to China.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody in the room can tell you who the president of Verizon is.
Yeah. So the question was, as in sociology, did corporate leaders once sort of be part of the community and reluctant to be pay themselves so much and be as harsh on their workers, and now they're isolated? I'm not sure that CEOs were ever really, even at 40 times your average worker's income, probably not. You're not going to be living in the same town. But there may be some. I guess I should take you, one of my favorite lines in old economics was Robert Solow, Nobel laureate, talking about, he's actually talking about growth issues, but it applies to a lot of things, that all of the discussions end in a blaze of amateur sociology. And this does tend to happen in these areas. But actually, I'll give you, and this, I guess, will be my concluding remark here. I wonder now, to some extent, whether sociology, in a perverse way, is actually preventing some corporate leaders from being more pro-worker than they might. And the case in point, there's people I talked with in this talking about healthcare, and there's a real argument about what is the right healthcare system. But if you think about the interests of the auto companies, and actually a number of large corporations, they would be a whole lot better off under a Canadian-style system, in which the government pays for health insurance, and it's not a burden, because they provide that themselves now, and other companies don't, and it's very expensive. And in fact, in Canada, the big three automakers, which are the same as the ones here, and the United Auto Workers Union, which is again the same union of the Canadian branch, make joint presentations every year to the government saying, do not tamper with Medicare, that's what they call their universal system, because it's a tremendous competitive advantage to us. The question is, why doesn't Rick Wagner of General Motors go before Congress and say, no, we need national health care? And he actually gives speeches about the terrible burden of healthcare costs on GM. then it looks like the speech is heading right towards, and we need a Canadian-style system, and then at the last moment, it sort of veers off. And the question has been, why? You know, whether you think it's a good thing or not, why doesn't GM? Probably good for GM. Why don't they do it? Why don't they advocate it? And the answer I keep on hearing from people is, yes, but then Wagner couldn't show his face at the country club. So maybe that this is different kind of thing. It's your argument, it's the other way around. Anyway, it's a very strange thing. I would say the White House wants to know why people aren't more enthused about the economy. I want to know why people aren't more outraged about that. I guess we both have our frustrations. Thanks.